Hello and welcome inside episode 15 of the That Movie Is Ours Now podcast. If it's your first time here, it's really nice to meet you. My name is David Sugarman. If you come back, thank you. It's really good to see you again. If you like what you hear today, subscribe, like, comment, no matter where you're listening or watching. That just helps the podcast grow. It helps other people find it and hopefully like what they hear. If you've seen Killers of the Flower Moon, this is sort of your, even though it's history, I always feel weird saying this, but this is sort of your spoiler warning for Killers of the Flower Moon, because we are having a deep dive discussion with the managing editor of RogerEbert.com, and he writes some great stuff in a whole lot of other places too that we'll talk about, Brian Tallerico. It was really great talking with Brian. We talked for about 15-20 minutes about Killers of the Flower Moon, and then I got some questions related to being a film critic from my Tik Tok account that Brian was kind enough to answer as well. So you'll get to learn a little bit about that, and certainly hear our discussion about Killers of the Flower Moon. I think one of the most anticipated movies of the year. A Scorsese movie is always going to be highly anticipated, but even maybe more so right now when a lot of people are hungry and thirsty for something that feels epic and like a huge movie that isn't, and I love Marvel, but isn't necessarily Marvel or Marvel adjacent or just a big action spectacle. And just for the record, like, I've got my Spider-Man mug, so like I get it, I really do. But there are a lot of people who want something different, and this movie provided that. I really enjoyed the movie. I had some issues, but wanted to talk to Brian about it because I remember as soon as my conversation was over with Brian, I said, "Oh, like that's why he is a film critic, not because his opinions were right and my opinions were wrong, but he knew how, I think you'll see, to articulate himself and explain not just his depth of knowledge, but of having seen so many movies and so many pieces of work, but being able to explain and put it in context and really drive the discussion forward." So I think his writing is really good. I really enjoyed our conversation here, and I don't want to ramble anymore. I just want to get to it. Again, like, subscribe, comment. It just helps the podcast grow. And this is episode 15 of the That Movie Is Ours Now podcast. And here he is, Brian Tallerico. He's the managing editor for RogerEbert.com. He's appeared in Vulture, New York Times, a whole lot of places. I won't put all the flattery on you in front of you. But Brian, thanks so much for hopping on the podcast this week.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive right into Killers of the Flower Moon. It's going to be it's always weird saying spoilers with a historical thing, but there will be spoilers. It's now been out for almost a month as you record this. The first thing in reading your review that caught my eye and what everyone wanted to talk about upon first getting ready for the film was the runtime. It's almost 3.5 hours. One thing that I thought, length aside, it was really well paced, and you point out a lot of that had to do with a frequent collaborator of Martin Scorcese, which is his editor, Thelma Schoonmaker. I think I'm saying that right. What do you think they did together and she did in the editing process that didn't make 3.5 hours, whether you like the film or not, feel that long? Because the editing, it felt so well paced, and I like that you pointed that out.
Well, there's the cliche that a movie's made 3 times when it's written, shot, and edited. So Thelma gets a lot of the credit for Marty's work over the years. Oh, I hate when people call it Marty like they know him. Scorsese's work over the years. And yet it's so easy to do for some reason. But anyway, I'll try to avoid doing that. She really helped Scorsese. I don't want to say like assisted with his voice, but what we consider that Scorsese voice, those cuts in Goodfellas and Casino and that rhythm, Thelma is responsible for a lot of that. Like he would absolutely credit her with a lot of that. So they kind of, I noted in my review that he works with a lot of people in this film that he's worked with before. They have a shorthand. They know how to develop this project in a way that makes it flow, and everything works together. The editing, the production design, the cinematography. It's like a symphony. If one thing's out of tune, I think you'd feel the length more. But because the cinematography and Robertson's score and Thelma's editing, it's all of a piece. You don't notice the seams, you don't notice the cracks, you don't notice any sags. At least I don't. I've heard people complain it's too long. I have a feeling a lot of those people were ready to complain it was too long before they saw it.
Sure.
But I don't want to get too deep into that. That's fine. If you think it's too long, fine. Go watch your 10 hours Netflix miniseries on a weekend and don't complain for some reason. And actually,
that's a whole nother discussion.
yeah, it's a whole nother discussion. It'll be on Apple and people can take breaks and do what they want, and that'll be fine. So
absolutely. And I think, length and pace, I think get confused a lot. There are three, like I happen to think I had some problems with Oppenheimer, but it was well paced and it moved and it was crisp. And, at least for me, it never felt like, 3 hours. I don't know that it felt like 2, but it didn't feel like 3.
We've all seen short, long movies, and we've all seen long, short movies. I was at Toronto this year and I saw a 3.5-hour documentary about Paul Simon that I loved. Didn't feel a minute of it. Went to the next movie that was 90 minutes long and almost fell asleep. So it really doesn't matter in terms of it grabs you and it interests you. Length is subjective.
Scorsese's movies are, they always have a certain, pace and volatileness to them. I think what I'm getting at is I really enjoyed that in your review. You found a thread through this film, through a lot of his other film, because films on the surface, this doesn't feel or look like most of his at least mainstream popular work. It doesn't feel like Wolf of Wall Street or Goodfellas or even like a more modern Shutter Island, Raging Bull. But you made some points. I'd love you to expand. Why do you think, in some ways in tone, this did feel similar to some of his other work?
I'm not sure I'd agree with the founding part of your statement, because I do think Scorsese has been underrated in terms of being a cinematic historian. In other words, he's always kind of looked at history. You can go back to Casino being the formation of Vegas, Wolf of Wall Street's based on a true story, The Aviator. Like he does seem to have an interest in history, and I think this fits right in his historical epics. I also think there's an interesting thing, very interesting, and I'm writing a piece on this for Arrow, small little plug that'll be up hopefully relatively soon when I get done with it, about his post-Departed films, about everything he's done since he won that elusive Oscar. And I think it's a really fascinating array of movies. I hate to say it, but they're old man movies. They're movies of a man looking back on his life, asking questions. Why do I make movies? Hugo. What has led to the downfall of capitalism? Wolf of Wall Street. Of course, Silence is maybe his most personal movie, questioning faith and religion. And I think with this movie, he's doing nothing less than asking, like, how we got here. How did we get to such a violent, divisive time? And how did we build this country on the bodies of people who were here before us? And I do think there's something to this movie that would be different if he made it 30 years ago. There's a looking back on his life and career in America that he's been a part of in an old man's perspective. I'm not sure that was your question. I think you wanted me to mention that this is a gangster movie, which it very much is. If you think about it, what DiCaprio and De Niro do in this is not that different from what they do in Backrooms and Goodfellas and all those other movies. So there is that element too, in that this is about a criminal underworld. Like the people in Goodfellas taking power and doing whatever they want is not that different from what the bad guys do in this movie.
And hey, I don't want you to go anywhere with that. I'm not trying to lead you anywhere. I just, like having these types of discussions. And I think one of, the quote that you opened up your review with, which was used in a lot of the marketing and stuck with a lot of people. Do you see the wolves in this picture? And I think one way this film resonated with me, I think you look around and at the political landscape and just what I'll call just evil at large, if you will, no matter where you stand, you think, you see some sort of evil in the world. It feels like everyone's saying the quiet part out loud. And that's what it felt like was happening in this film. That, yes, of course, there's some underhanded and deceiving going on, but at the same time, Hale and even Ernest, to an extent, they're not really trying to hide their intention. The evil is barely even hiding in plain sight, which was sort of scary to see that still resonated.
And they barely ask moral questions. There's a different version of this movie where like Hale and Burkhart are sitting in a room wondering if they should do things. Mm-hmm. They immediately start robbing and murdering as if they're getting coffee, doing something else. I wish I could credit the person. I read an interesting thing the other day that noted that when Hale is watching the Tulsa massacre footage, they read that as him thinking he wasn't moving quickly enough. In other words, he was inspired by the Tulsa massacre footage to then amp up his work. And if you think about it, the murders do escalate after that sequence. And so the idea is he was inspired by subjugation and murder. These weren't people who had, especially Hale, who had moral consequences or concern whatsoever. Like, he can't believe he's getting arrested in the end. He can't believe there's a trial in the end, which of course, again, I don't want to get too political. There's certain people who do things and can't believe they're on trial for the things that they did.
Certainly.
And I do think Scorsese means that interpretation. I do think I'm big on art doesn't exist in a vacuum. Every piece of art that is made reflects something about the time in which it was made. And Scorsese, of course, is such an empathetic, brilliant human being that he's going to reflect the divisiveness and the current political figures who may be doing things and gaslighting us to believe they're not doing them.
I'd love to get your opinion on and maybe pushback on the one big problem I had with the film is we got into specifically the back third. It turned into a courtroom drama, and a courtroom drama that I felt was about the wrong characters. I felt like in the back third of the film, we shifted away from Molly and we got a little too focused on Ernest, in particular, and Ernest and Hale. And I think that was a worry going into the film. And Scorsese does a lot of wonderful things that, are we going to trust an older, white man to tell the story of the Osage tribe, which he does well in a myriad of ways. I'd love to get your thoughts on that, because I don't say this to be unique. As I've read other people's reviews,
Sure,
I don't feel like I've seen that around. So could I be missing something or misinterpreting something?
Oh, not seeing that it's not that's from the wrong POV. I've seen that a lot, and I think that's valid. I think that's totally valid. I know this isn't great for the hot take film machine, but I'm not big on like trying to argue POV cases. I do think representation and who gets to tell what stories is very important. The one thing I would say though is you got to ask yourself what the alternative is. Like, I think for some people the alternative is Marty never makes this movie, and that's fine if that's where you're going to go. But if the alternative is like Molly rises up and saves herself, like, I think the point of the movie is that she couldn't. The point of the movie is that the system was so worked against her that we had to create the FBI to save her. And then even after that, when her story was told, the murders were never mentioned. That key last moment where Scorsese says, we've told these stories, basically comes out and looks at the camera and says, we've told these stories for years and we haven't told them the right way. And this is my attempt to kind of tell it the right way. So if you're asking for the back third to be more about Molly, I think that betrays the point of the film. That's the only argument I would make.
No, I like that a lot. And it's interesting. Of course, a lot of people, or at least a lot of the film nerds in the audience, were pointing, that's him at the very end. However, the ending maybe struck me the most, not just because we had the unexpected or, time leap a little bit. It very much struck me the way we sort of, as a society, like now consume almost on steroids these true crime documentaries, and it's sort of like junk food, like cotton candy, which was something I didn't expect to get snuck in at the end, and it didn't feel tacked on. What were your thoughts on that final scene and what it might have been saying?
I've read that, the idea that it's a commentary on true crime. I think it's a commentary on who gets to tell what stories and representation in general. In other words, he's forwarding the argument against the film that so many people have made, which is that, maybe this isn't my story to tell, but here I am up on a stage with sound effects, with no real stakes, like with Jack White and other players doing fun little things. But I think the key is the last line, which is where he talks about Molly's life and he says there was no mention of the murders. We've told these stories for years. We've hidden these people. We've hidden the truth about it. I think he's trying to say the true crime thing doesn't quite gel for me because of that line. Like, he's trying to land. I guess it does, because true crime so often tells stories the wrong way. Like, if you hate true crime, then the true crime thing works. Yes, because true crime is another thing where we don't tell the right stories necessarily. He's basically saying, hey, ask yourself not only how we got here, but how we learn about how we got here, what stories we're going to tell next. Next time we tell Molly's story, or people like Molly, we should mention the murders. Next time we talk about the history of America, we should mention the murders.
I think the last thing about the last big thing I wanted to ask in terms of, your line or one of the parts of your review is that, of course, in a big historical epic, I think a lot of historical epics and biopics can feel quite overtly preachy, and nobody likes, even if it's the right thing, nobody likes to be preached at. You didn't feel it came across that way, and neither did I. I think this is a direct quote. They played the reality of the situation, and it
Yeah,
wasn't a history lesson.
yeah.
How did Scorsese and how did Killers of the Flower Moon accomplish that?
That's the ensemble, and of course Scorsese, how he works with actors, such a phenomenal director of performers, people who can, especially Lily Gladstone. Like Lily Gladstone never looks like she's playing to the camera or like she knows she's playing something bigger than her character. There are a lot of performers who would have taken that performance and tried to play all indigenous people, where she's just
Mhm.
playing Molly. And I think that's a huge, crucial difference. And it's one of the reasons her performance is so good. And I think De Niro hasn't been this good in a very, very long time. Like, I think it's an all-timer. Oh, I love his work in The Irishman. That's another old man movie, looking back, by the way. That's literally what that movie is. So other than The Irishman and this, I mean, I think he's phenomenal here. I think he sells. You can see Hale's evil wheels turning in almost every scene. He sells the intelligence and the vile viciousness of this man in a fascinating way. So yeah, I guess I'm just talking about actors who feel present and who feel like they're playing characters instead of messages or themes or symbols. No one in this movie feels like they're playing a symbol.
There are so many different things to potentially pull away from this film. Now that you've had a few weeks or even maybe a month to sit on it, has what has stayed with you the most?
The craftsmanship, probably. Although, I'm not, I don't think this is your question, but this is where I'm going to take it.
Sure.
I think the films that last and my favorite films of almost every year are the films that produce the most interesting conversation. And I've seen such fascinating pieces about this movie that hated it. I've seen fascinating pieces about this movie that talk about representation and POV and who gets to tell what stories. And I thought they were great. I'm at a stage in my career where I want to read things that don't necessarily reflect my worldview. I'm tired of the echo chambers of Twitter and social media. I'm tired of whenever I write a piece like this, which was my highest, I give 4 stars like 2 or 3 times a year. I gave 4 stars to this movie. So it was a rave. And I immediately went to try to find all the negative reviews. So I love the conversations that this movie has started. And I think Scorsese would too. I think he wants to make movies that get people talking. And so that's what I'm taking away from this movie in its cultural moment. I'm curious to see what happens. I'm actually a little dreading what happens when it gets on Apple and it gets turned into like, we take like the Marriage Story thing where you take one scene and make fun of it on TikTok for a few weeks. I think that is going to be horrendous, but let's enjoy this moment now where we can appreciate it. And then once we get through that wave of dissecting beats by beats and making fun of like a look that Leo makes in one scene, which you know is going to happen on TikTok, that stuff's going to be horrible. But in general, but even that, like, I'm tired of movies. I guess maybe as I do a lot of TV too, and I've been Netflix to death. I'm tired of movies that just feed the algorithm and become content, and this movie's not doing that. So what I'm taking away from it is that this feels like art, even to the people who don't like it. It's a conversation starter and it's artistry, and not just something that we watch on a weekend and disappears.
I couldn't agree more with that. Whatever problems you have with the film or not, I think a lot of important discussions and really good, healthy discussions, even good debate has been born out of people, and hopefully more people seeing this film. I got a few questions from the TikTok.
Sure.
That going off.
I watch TikTok all the time. No offense to TikTok. It's just not exactly great for film criticism in terms of like how it takes things and just takes them out of context.
Well, so that's one of the questions is, and I hope I have this right. Stone Medical Movie Man. What are your general thoughts on Movie Talk, as it's called? I know you sort of answered that, but
well, no, I'm talking about the worst, the evil side of it. The side of it that takes Adam Driver in Marriage Story and auto-tunes his voice and just spins it around. I'm not talking about like people with actual opinions. I do think there are people on Movie Talk with actual opinions who are dissecting things and trying to find a new way to bring them to audiences. So that's valuable. I think any conversation about art is valuable. And I think TikTok is a major conversation platform right now. I was talking about like, you know what I mean? You've seen it. The memification of art is what I'm talking about.
As someone who does this in his free time, and then also my job is in social media.
Yeah.
So I totally understand. Let's learn a little bit about you. Little KTV wanted to ask you, what made you want to become a film critic?
The cheesiest possible answer. I always was. I was the film critic for my middle school newspaper. I've literally been doing this for almost 40 years. Middle school, high school, college. After I graduated college, I just wrote emails of movie reviews to my friends and family until I started to get paid for it. So, like, I've done this forever. And so I kind of don't really remember. I loved movies. I guess I would say this, and I've talked about this a lot. My parents instilled in me the idea that movies were conversation starters and things for discussion, not just something to ingest like fast food. So we'd watch a Hitchcock movie and then we'd talk about it. Even television. I remember watching like Northern Exposure and Twin Peaks when I was young and then having conversations about the writing and what the episodes were doing with my family. So I think that kind of intellectual dissection of art instilled in me its value, and I wanted to be a part of it. I mean, I never thought I could get to where I am now. It was always a hobby for the longest time. I was actually a theater and English major. I thought I'd be a screenwriter. I was a theater director for a while here in Chicago. I directed a play. So I have a really varied and strange background. And then I kept working at writing. I volunteered at a site back in 2001. My first big thing was doing Sopranos recaps way back in the day. And I cut my teeth on that. And I actually shook David Chase's hand and thanked him for that not that long ago, which was super cool. And I wrote 1,000 pieces for free before I got paid. Like I just threw pieces to every site I possibly could. And then I just kept getting attention and getting noticed, and where I am now. So.
Well, as a New Jersey native and a massive fan of The Sopranos, very, very jealous of even to be in the same stratosphere for a moment as David Chase.
It was amazing. It was amazing. Yeah, it was a moment of like, I'm not sure I'd be here without you. So yeah, it was very cool.
Yeah, there are a lot of Davids out there, and I'm very jealous of that David. I usually like being myself, but if I could be like David Chase for like a day or two, that'd be pretty good. Just a couple more here for you. This is a funny one from Richard Hogarth. Have you ever walked out of a movie or been close?
Not completely. For a very long time, as I just mentioned, I've been doing this forever. Almost everything I've seen, I turn into content. Even now, it's kind of like a problem. Like everything other than sport. That's why I watch as much NFL and NBA as I do, because it's the only thing I don't have to write about. So so if I was walking out of a movie, I wouldn't get paid, or I wouldn't be able to write the piece. I will say this: Transformers 2, I had to like get up, walk around the lobby for a minute, gather myself, and come back in. I needed to okay, I can take a deep breath and then go back in and watch the end of this horrible movie.
It's funny, and I'm not, I was a target audience when those came out. I was a teenage boy, and I went and saw the second, which I think is like Revenge of the
Dark
Fallen?
Side of the Moon or something. No, something of the
Dark
Moon.
Side of the Moon, maybe. Okay,
well, that's a Pink Floyd album. It's something of the Moon. I can't remember.
Whatever the second one was, I went to see with my grandfather, who he didn't care. He was like, okay, big robots. Is that what you want to see? Sure. And I remember him just sort of I was glued as 11, 12 years old. And he sort of I remember sort of kept looking at me, and then it ended. And he was like, oh, something, kiddo. A lot of who was the good guy and what was going on. And
I didn't hate the first one. I thought the first one was actually okay.
The first one was quite good, actually.
And then the second one is just getting beaten over the head with metal pots and pans for 2.5 hours. And I was like, all right, I need to catch my breath. So.
Just one or two more for you. Spencer Talks Film and TV wants to know kind of a dual question. What's your rating criteria for films, and do you rate films differently based on a genre or an expectation?
Oh, there's a lot in that one there. I kind of hate star ratings because I think they can change. It might be different in a day. I always tell my writers at Ebert to just go with their gut and don't get hung up on it for too long. If they're asking how do I judge a film, not what's my star rating system, I do firmly believe in judging a film based on if it achieves what it sets out to do. In other words, if it's a comedy, does it make you laugh? If it's an action movie, does it thrill you? that kind of thing. So you judge it on its own terms. So the idea that a horror or an action movie would be lesser than a drama, there's none of that. Like I gave John Wick 4 3.5 stars. I think it might still be in my top 10. So like I'm good with genre stuff if it's done really well. I love the recent Mission Impossible movies, including this year's. I think Spider-Verse is one of the best movies of the year, probably top 5 or 6. So like I'm down with what you would call popular entertainment being as good as the quote unquote serious stuff.
I think question-wise, you have done a fantastic job. Brian, where can people find your work? I know you're in a lot of different places as we listed. Where are the best places to find your work and the other talented reviewers over at RogerEbert.com?
Well, RogerEbert.com is the main outlet. That's where you'll find me most of the time. I got 3 reviews there tomorrow. 3 reviews there tomorrow. I also do regular TV stuff for the playlist, and I do a lot of streaming guides for Vulture. I've got a piece running soon at Arrow Films about Scorsese. I've got a piece running at the Time soon about Fargo, the show. And I hate to, given the ship is sinking as fast as it is right now, still my biggest following though is at X/Twitter/ whatever we want to call it, Brian _Tallerico. But my Blue Sky thing is pinned at the top, and you can find me on Letterboxd. So there's life rafts, but I'll still occasionally promote stuff over there. So that might be the best place to find me until the ship finally goes down.
Last one I'll leave you with, as somebody who personally has been trying to dive into film criticism more, and I know a lot of people on TikTok and a whole lot of platforms, and Letterboxd is wonderful, are trying to, go about it in the right way and trying to have, really appreciate the art form. What would be your biggest piece of advice for people trying to develop, their voice and their style and trying to criticize or film criticism in this, really changing landscape of, with social media and everything new that is coming about?
My main piece of advice for young writers is insanely simple and kind of silly almost, but it's write all the time, like every single day. Write constantly. It's how you develop your voice. It's how you develop your rhythm. It's how you develop practicing. Even great artists and musicians have to do it constantly. Keith Richards is still picking up his guitar and fiddling with it all the time. I guarantee it. Like a lot of people think they're a writer if they write a review every once a month. You're not. Like you got to keep it up. You got to keep the flow going. You got to keep active. Even if you don't have a place to put it, write an email and send it to your friends and family about what you thought of Killers of the Flower Moon. They might find it interesting, and it'll help you hone how you express yourself and how you appreciate art and how you value art. So write all the time and read all the time. Find people you like and read them. By osmosis, you will get a better voice. You will help find your voice, not just criticism. Read fiction, read anything, read the newspaper, sentence structure, vocabulary. You can't have that. No offense, TikTokers. You can't have that just from watching TikTok. Like you need to put words in front of your eyes if you want them to come out. That's how it goes. So.
Love that. Brian, thanks so much for hopping on. This was a blast. I'm glad that we were able to do this. And we'll have to get together again soon. This has been another episode of the That Movie Is Ours Now podcast with Brian Tallerico.